Welcome to Common Hour. My name is Anne Statura, and I am the coordinator for community-based learning and community outreach in the Spanish department and chair of the Common Hour committee this fall. I'd like to introduce our ASL interpreter, Emily Phipps. Thank you, Emily, for interpreting for us at Common Hour. A very warm welcome to all at our third Common Hour of the semester. Common Hour is a unique and inclusive program that brings the Franklin and Marshall community together weekly during the academic year for culturally and intellectually enriching events. It is the only regularly scheduled event that unites students, faculty, and staff, and invites the larger community to join us. Throughout the pandemic, the Common Hour has continued to provide a virtual gathering space and a source of inspiration, education, and compelling discussion for the F&M community and beyond. We hope you will join us during Common Hour next week for our virtual event, Autocracy in Russia and Beyond, a Mueller lecture by award-winning author and journalist Masha Gessen. The Common Hour Committee is pleased to announce a call for proposals for Spring 2023 in-person Common Hour events. Additionally, please consider submitting a proposal for the December 1st Now Hour. Proposals are being accepted now through November 1st. During today's event, Zoom viewers can submit questions for our speaker via the Q&A feature. Please indicate your affiliation with the college, but we do not need your name. And now, I'd like to introduce Jim Strick, Associate Professor in the Department of Earth and Environment and Chair of the Program in Science, Technology, and Society, who will present today's speaker.
Thanks very much, Anne. I'm very pleased to welcome to Franklin and Marshall, Alicia Sanders-Zakre, who is the Policy and Research Coordinator at the International Campaign to Abolish Nuclear Weapons, or ICAN. ICAN is a global civil society coalition working to promote adherence to and full implementation of the Treaty on the Prohibition of Nuclear Weapons. The campaign helped to bring about this treaty. ICAN was launched in 2007 and currently counts 607 partner organizations in 106 countries. The organization was awarded the 2017 Nobel Peace Prize for its work. Alicia, our guest, directs and coordinates research on the treaty, the humanitarian impact of nuclear weapons, and general nuclear weapons policy. I've posted the website of ICAN in the chat. Previously, Alicia was a researcher at the Arms Control Association and at the Brookings Institution. She's published over 100 news articles, editorials, and reports on nuclear weapons, including in The Guardian, The Baltimore Sun, Arms Control Today, the Bulletin of the Atomic Scientists, and the National Interest. Alicia holds a bachelor's degree in international security from Tufts University, as well as a certificate of completion in international nuclear safeguards policy from the Middlebury Institute of International Studies, and has just recently completed a Master of Advanced Studies in the International Law of Armed Conflict. I can't help but put in a plug here. I will be teaching my course, ENE STS 313, Nuclear Weapons, Power, and Waste Disposal, in the spring. Students interested in this talk may want to sign up for it. And Alicia, perhaps we can get you to join our class by Zoom in the spring for some more involved discussion of this topic. So Alicia Sanders-Zakre, welcome.
Great. Well, thank you so much for having me here. I'm really looking forward to this talk, which unfortunately is very timely in this moment. I'm going to just share my screen to share some slides. Great. All right. So I'll be talking today about the work of ICAN and our work to ban and eliminate nuclear weapons, and providing a bit of an overview about the state of nuclear weapons in the world today and why it's so important to work towards their elimination. So I'll start off talking a little bit about the campaign, about who is ICAN. As was mentioned earlier, we're a really broad coalition of non-governmental organizations, all working to promote a world free of nuclear weapons. And our primary tool to do that is the UN Treaty on the Prohibition of Nuclear Weapons. And I'll speak in more detail about that later on. But as was mentioned, we have over 600 partner organizations in over 100 countries. So it's a really big, diverse campaign with people from around the world. Originally, the campaign was started in Australia in 2017, and we're now headquartered in Geneva, Switzerland, which is where I'm calling in from today. And in 2017, we won the Nobel Peace Prize for our work to achieve the UN Treaty on the Prohibition of Nuclear Weapons. So, as I said, we work with really a lot of different aspects of society, from governments to international organizations like the different National Red Cross societies, as well as the International Committee of the Red Cross, with faith-based leaders, with the survivors of the atomic bombings of Hiroshima and Nagasaki, as well as of nuclear testing. This is really a core component of ICAN's work, is working with those who have lived experience of nuclear weapons, who are the real experts of nuclear weapons and who have been calling for their prohibition and elimination really from day one. And we have kind of some prominent supporters who I've listed here below. And, I would add, I guess, in the faith-based leaders recently, the Pope has been very supportive of the Treaty on the Prohibition of Nuclear Weapons and our work. So very glad to have them a part of this team. One of the biggest moments for the campaign, I would say, was in 2017 when we were awarded the Nobel Peace Prize. And that was for our work to draw attention to the catastrophic humanitarian consequences of any use of nuclear weapons, as well as our work to get the Treaty on the Prohibition of Nuclear Weapons adopted. And it's really remarkable to be awarded this prize. I think it's been a really valuable tool for the campaign because it really was awarded to the entire campaign. It wasn't awarded to one individual in the campaign. And that makes it something that any partner organization can use in their local campaigning and work to promote the treaty. And so it's something that, I think has been a really useful tool and asset to the campaign, and representative, I guess, of the work of kind of collective action to get something done. So here you have a photo of our executive director, Beatrice Finn, with Setsuko Thurlow, who survived the atomic bombing of Hiroshima when she was 13. And is really a prominent member of the ICAN community, accepting the Nobel Peace Prize in 2017. And again, here's kind of a stage full of campaigners from really around the world. I see campaigners from Australia, from the UK, from Japan, from the Philippines, really from around the world, celebrating the awarding of the Nobel Peace Prize. And I think it's, speaks to, again, the power of the diversity of the campaign to achieve this goal. And this is from the Nobel ceremony and launch in Oslo. There were about 4,000 people who gathered to celebrate the awarding of the prize. And again, I think here we have a gathering in Hiroshima, actually, where campaigners were pushing for the Treaty on the Prohibition of Nuclear Weapons. And I think it shows the kind of symbolism and significance of the treaty and the prize for survivors of nuclear weapons use and testing. So that's a bit about ICAN, but I also want to talk about nuclear weapons. why are we working to ban and eliminate them? It may seem kind of obvious on the surface, but I think it's often an issue that we don't think about every day. Now we're thinking about it a bit more. And it's important to remember kind of why it's such a problem. So here I've put just in the past week some of the nuclear threats that we've been seeing, particularly from Vladimir Putin in the context of the war in Ukraine. This is a really significant and concerning statement that he just issued, where he essentially, threatened to use nuclear weapons in response to a breach on Russian territorial integrity. And I think really underscores the risks posed by nuclear weapons, because even though Russia has an official doctrine about its nuclear weapons, it says it will only use nuclear weapons if the survival of the state essentially is at stake. And this is common for a lot of countries. You see that sometimes that policy doesn't always translate into reality. And now that Russia is under threat, they're even saying they might use nuclear weapons in response to a territorial invasion, which kind of goes beyond that official policy and makes it clear the unpredictability and uncertainty as long as nuclear weapons exist and the risk of their use. I think this also, it's important to note how the US responded to Russian threats to use nuclear weapons, that there could be catastrophic consequences. And while we don't know if this necessarily means nuclear weapons retaliation, it's certainly on the table. And given what we know about the humanitarian consequences of nuclear weapons, which I'll talk about in the next slides, this is really unacceptable, any use of nuclear weapons. So this is a photo of a nuclear weapons test in Bikini Atoll in the Marshall Islands. This is a thermal nuclear weapon being tested, and you can obviously see the shocking humanitarian, consequences and destruction posed by just one nuclear weapon, and even this is just one quote-unquote nuclear test that had severe consequences but wasn't dropped, for example, directly on a city. So what do we mean when we talk about the catastrophic harm of nuclear weapons and these humanitarian consequences? Nuclear weapons are really in a class of their own. They are the most destructive, inhumane, and indiscriminate weapons ever created. Just one nuclear weapon detonated could kill hundreds of thousands or millions of people, depending on how densely populated the area is where it's dropped. And climate scientists are still studying the effects of just a relatively small number of nuclear weapons, the effects on the climate. And what they found, this goes back to studies decades ago into this phenomenon called nuclear winter, but studies that have been updated recently. What they've found is that even the use of 100 nuclear weapons could cause really catastrophic climate disruptions. And this is largely due to the massive fires that would erupt after the use of these weapons that would lead to soot entering the atmosphere and essentially blocking out sunlight and causing agricultural collapse and famine. Nuclear weapons have been used twice in warfare, in Hiroshima and Nagasaki. And what we know from the detonation of these weapons, which are relatively small yield nuclear weapons in terms of today's modern arsenals, is that hundreds of thousands were immediately killed. And then there was long-term, lasting to today, long-term radiation-linked diseases, and that there's no emergency response capacity. And this is where the role of the Red Cross has really come in the disarmament movement, is they witnessed what happened in Hiroshima and Nagasaki and realized that there's no, once nuclear weapons are used, there's no response capacity. The only solution is to work towards their elimination. So I think, and again, we know that nuclear weapons are very destructive in the immediate term, that they cause massive deaths. But what's really uniquely horrible about nuclear weapons is the long-term radiation effects, and that there are still many people around the world who continue to suffer from nuclear weapons detonated in 1945, as well as those tested in the decades following. And in addition to these, physical health problems, there's also psychological concerns and psychological damage of wondering if your children are going to get sick. When are you going to get sick? This is something that we hear from survivors in our campaign over and over again. So I've spoken about this a bit, but it's really important not to neglect the long-term and ongoing impact of nuclear weapons testing. It's really remarkable that there have been more than 2,000 nuclear tests since 1945, including many before it was banned, many tests in the atmosphere, as well as tests underground and underwater. And that this has had also long-term lasting humanitarian consequences. And one of our partners, the International Physicians for the Prevention of Nuclear War, has estimated that millions of people will continue to suffer and to pass away due to the nuclear tests that took place for decades between 1945 and 1980, the atmospheric tests. Just to say, if you're interested in learning more about this, ICAN launched a new interactive map website. And if you go to this website, nucleartestimpacts.org, you can actually kind of explore around the map and see, for example, where was there nuclear testing near you. There were about over 1,000 tests actually carried out within the United States, particularly around the Nevada test sites. And you can kind of hear more directly from survivors about the impacts and what they've been doing to fight for justice. So definitely recommend checking that out if you're interested. I'm not going to show this now for time, but I also do really recommend, I'll try to put the link in the chat, watching this video by a spoken word artist, Kathy Jetnell-Kinger. It's from the Marshall Islands, speaking about the impact of nuclear testing in the Marshall Islands. Oh. Sorry, one moment. Sorry about that. So that's kind of the history of the impacts of nuclear weapons use in testing. But what about nuclear weapons today? So there are about 13,000 nuclear weapons in the world today. So that's when I said earlier that the use of a small number of nuclear weapons, 100 nuclear weapons, could cause global climate catastrophe. It's small relative to the amount of nuclear weapons still in the world today. And I think this is something we can forget when we think about nuclear weapons as something of the past, is that they're still very much present. And the US and Russia hold the vast majority of these nuclear weapons, but there are 9 countries that have nuclear weapons, including China, France, the United Kingdom, Pakistan, India, Israel, and North Korea. And in addition, there are also 5 countries in Europe that host US nuclear weapons on their territory, which is, I think, important to keep in mind in the context of the current crisis. As I mentioned earlier, these warheads are much more destructive than the ones that were dropped in Hiroshima and Nagasaki. To give you an idea, the yield of nuclear weapons is measured in essentially kilotons of TNT, kind of the equivalent explosive force of kilotons of TNT. And the bomb dropped on Hiroshima was the equivalent of 15 kilotons of TNT. And many modern nuclear arsenals are more in the realm of 100 or 300, if not more. And yes, as I mentioned, in addition to the 9 countries that have nuclear weapons, there's also a number of countries that are under this nuclear umbrella that are part of kind of extended security agreements where a nuclear armed state like the United States agrees to protect non-nuclear armed states, namely many in Europe, in NATO, if there is an attack on that state with nuclear weapons. So despite this kind of widespread nuclear weapons policies, there are a number of countries whose populations don't support nuclear weapons being based in their country or their country having a nuclear weapons-based security policy. And these are a number of kind of the groups that ICAN works with. We do polling to demonstrate kind of the lack of public support for nuclear weapons in many countries, as you can see here. So that's a bit of an overview of kind of the state of nuclear weapons in the world today, of ICAN as a campaign. But I'd like to talk a bit more about what we do and kind of how we try to eliminate nuclear weapons, which is obviously a massive task. And our main tool is by banning nuclear weapons. And I'll go into a bit of the history of the strategy, getting to, of course, the Treaty on the Prohibition of Nuclear Weapons and what that's all about. But essentially what we've seen is that with a number of weapons that are kind of now considered taboo, what happened before they were considered taboo is that they were subject to an international prohibition on these weapons. And they have a lot of things in common. They're kind of go against the rules of international humanitarian law that you can see, for example, in the Geneva Conventions. And some of those core principles are that weapons should be able to distinguish between civilians and those in the military, that weapons actually shouldn't cause unnecessary suffering, like suffering that's not necessary to meet the military objective of the state. And so other examples of weapons like this include biological weapons, chemical weapons, landmines, and cluster munitions. And there are treaties that ban all of these weapons. And now there is a treaty that also bans nuclear weapons. So how did we get to having a treaty that bans nuclear weapons? This was really the goal of ICAN when it was launched in 2007. Was to achieve a ban on nuclear weapons. And we did that by seeking to really shift the narrative on nuclear weapons from kind of tools of legitimate statecraft that pose, that have a real security benefit for states, to kind of unveil them for what they are as weapons of mass destruction and as weapons that are designed to target civilian populations and to kill civilians. And this is something that we worked very closely with some of our key governmental partners and was issued in kind of joint statements to international bodies. So there was kind of this first statement really talking about nuclear weapons and the humanitarian consequences that they cause that was issued in 2012. That led to a series of conferences that a lot of governments attended that produced new research about the humanitarian consequences of nuclear weapons, that featured the survivors of nuclear weapons use and testing as the expert speakers. And the first one was in 2013 in Oslo. And then there was another one in the following year in Mexico, and then in Vienna. And following that, at the UN, the General Assembly of the UN, there was a resolution adopted to start negotiating a ban on nuclear weapons. And it was a really actually pretty fast process from when there was a mandate, when there was a resolution adopted to begin negotiations, to when the negotiations concluded and the treaty was adopted. And that happened in 2017. And there were 122 countries that were present in the negotiations and supported the adoption of the treaty. And then just a couple of months later, the treaty opened for signature, and it has now achieved all the necessary countries to join it for it to enter into force. So here's a photo from the adoption of the treaty. It was a really, I would say, joyous moment, particularly in as far as kind of UN conferences go. A really big moment of excitement in the room when this treaty was adopted. I also won't show this video, but I'll try to put the link in the chat. It's a really powerful speech by Setsuko Thurlow about the importance of the adoption of this treaty for survivors of Hiroshima and Nagasaki, who had been really calling for the prohibition and elimination of nuclear weapons for so many years. So what is this treaty? What's it all about? I won't go too much into detail, but we'll try to give a bit of an overview of what's in the treaty, and happy to answer more questions as well later on. So the treaty essentially, as I discussed, is really fills this gap in international law where you had a number of other, all other weapons of mass destruction were banned by international conventions. Nuclear weapons weren't banned yet. So it fills that gap by having a prohibition on nuclear weapons. There's really a lot of prohibitions within the treaty, but essentially the treaty has kind of two components. One is the prohibitions on all nuclear weapons activities, from possessing nuclear weapons to using nuclear weapons, threatening to use nuclear weapons, developing or testing nuclear weapons, and all of the above. And the treaty also has positive obligations. So really, given this recognition of the humanitarian impacts of past nuclear weapons use and testing, the countries that joined this treaty decided they were going to try to provide assistance to victims of nuclear weapons use and testing, and also to begin to remediate some of the environments that are still contaminated by nuclear weapons use and testing. And this is, again, really speaks to the humanitarian core of the treaty and how it's seeking to change the debate and change the narrative around nuclear weapons to focus on the people who have been affected by them the most. So here you have kind of a snapshot of the core prohibitions in the treaty, exactly what it does prohibit in terms of nuclear weapons, which is a pretty comprehensive list. A lot of times people ask about how is the treaty verifiable, and so I thought I'd include a couple slides about that. So one is in Article 3. Essentially, there is this international agency that works to ensure that countries that have a nuclear energy program aren't diverting material for nuclear weapons. And so countries have to have an agreement with this agency to ensure that they can do inspections in the country and can ensure that if they have a nuclear energy program, they're not trying to use that material for nuclear weapons. And then there's also a process in the treaty outlined that if a country with nuclear weapons joins the treaty, then they have to work to eliminate their nuclear weapons program and have that be verified by an independent international authority. Another, I think, interesting component is that countries have to adopt national legislation as well to make sure they're complying with the treaty. And so this is something that I think also speaks to kind of how international treaties can be verified and enforced. And again, I think another important component of this treaty is the work to get all countries on board. So as of yet, there are no nuclear armed countries that have joined this treaty, but it's the work of all the countries that have so far joined it to get them to do so, to pressure them to join the treaty and to eliminate their arsenals. And so here you have another kind of quote about the treaty from ICAN Executive Director Beatrice Finn in accepting the Nobel Prize about why, why prohibiting nuclear weapons is so important to lead towards their elimination. And again, I think a powerful quote from Setsuko. So we've achieved this major milestone of adopting a treaty banning nuclear weapons. But of course, our work is not done. And there's a lot that we're still working on to get towards the total elimination of nuclear weapons. So I'll speak a bit about the ongoing work of the campaign to get towards this goal. So a key way that we do that is by getting more countries to join the Treaty on the Prohibition of Nuclear Weapons. Every country that signs on to this norm is really helping to stigmatize nuclear weapons and make it increasingly unacceptable for the nuclear armed states to continue to hold on to nuclear weapons. Just as chemical weapons have become really a pariah weapon, we want to do the same with nuclear weapons. So we do this in a number of different ways. For example, we organize regional events and training for diplomats to get them to join the treaty. We provide tools for our local campaigners in countries that have not yet joined the treaty to help them get governments to sign and ratify it. We organize signing ceremonies at the United Nations as kind of an incentive for politicians to prioritize this issue and join the treaty. And we work now that the treaty has entered into force and has kind of these official meetings of states parties, meetings of countries that have joined the treaty. We work to support those and push for kind of progressive implementation of each aspect of the treaty. So here's an example of, for example, regional workshops that we've held in Nigeria and Ethiopia to raise awareness about the treaty and encourage more countries to join. So we're also active even in countries that are not as supportive of joining the treaty. Often countries, African countries, are big supporters of nuclear disarmament. And we just need to work with governments to help kind of facilitate their signature and ratification. But in some countries, for example, in Australia or in the United Kingdom, at the governmental level, there's not a big push for nuclear disarmament at the moment. So we work with different segments of local governments or the population to build pressure on the federal government to join the treaty. So a key role for this is in Europe, we call them parliamentarians, but in the US, we work with members of Congress to build up support and pressure on the federal government to join the treaty. So we have, for example, a pledge that elected representatives, hundreds of elected representatives have signed to get their country to join the treaty. In addition to this pledge, we also have cities appeal, and there are major cities around the world, from Paris to Berlin to Washington, DC in the US, where a local city council has adopted a resolution calling on the federal government to join the treaty. And we also, I think really work on showing the public support in many countries for joining the treaty and for nuclear disarmament by doing polling work. So here you can see some polls that we've conducted showing really broad popular support for joining this treaty and for nuclear disarmament, to kind of illustrate that often the kind of federal government position is at odds with what the people want on nuclear disarmament. We always make sure to celebrate signatures and ratifications in kind of these signing ceremonies and celebrations on social media. And I think in addition to joining the treaty, a lot of our work is, again, really pushing the stigma against nuclear weapons and shaming institutions that are affiliated with nuclear weapons production, doing research to find out who they are and calling them out. So, one of the key areas where we work on this is really calling out any financial institutions that are invested in the companies that produce nuclear weapons and calling on them to divest. And we do this through a major report called Don't Bank on the Bomb that provides a regular update on which companies are involved in nuclear weapons and which banks have ties to these companies as well, which is kind of a resource for campaigners to do actions. In addition, we have another research program, the Nuclear Weapons Ban Monitor, which highlights kind of how countries' activities go against the treaty and prohibitions in the treaty and work to call this out as a way for campaigners to use that to stigmatize these activities and work. So there's a lot that you can do if you want to get involved with ICAN. These are just 4 steps, but really there's kind of an infinite number, I would say. One is really lifting up this humanitarian message on nuclear weapons. I think, particularly today when there's kind of a conversation about Russian threats to use nuclear weapons, how do we counter these threats? You can get really lost in this like game theory, nuclear deterrence arguments and forget, the real humanitarian consequences of nuclear weapons and what they are and why any use of nuclear weapons would be unacceptable. So we have a lot of resources to share these stories of the survivors of nuclear weapons use and testing. Another is if you want to get involved with the parliamentary pledge, reach out to your member of Congress or other local elected official or the city's appeal. If kind of the city that you're in or your hometown wants to join the city's appeal, it's something that you can do. And then certainly working, for example, on stopping investments in nuclear weapons. You can find out if your local bank, for example, has ties to nuclear weapons producing companies with the Don't Bank on the Bomb resource. So yeah, it's a really broad campaign. There's lots of people involved from all different segments of society. And I think something that we see is always important, but particularly in light of today's current threats, really urgent to work towards the total elimination of nuclear weapons. So with that, I'm really interested in hearing from you, hearing any questions you might have and having the chance to engage in a bit of a discussion.
Thank you so much, Alicia, for your talk. And we have many good questions coming in, and there's still time to submit your question through the Q&A. Our first question comes from a faculty member. The faculty member asks, given Vladimir Putin's use of nuclear blackmail in Ukraine, how would ICAN's work influence a situation like this? For example, how can we avoid a situation where other nations abolish their weapons, but Putin refuses to do so?
Yeah, it's a great question. I think some of the work that we've done recently has been in really expanding our outreach and engagement in Eastern European countries. For example, with partners in Ukraine, with the opposition movement in Belarus, for example, who also really support nuclear disarmament. And I think that's key to keep in mind, that there are a lot of countries, from the former Soviet bloc who chose to get rid of their nuclear weapons after the nuclear weapons that were stationed on their territory after the fall of the Soviet Union. And so, most countries around the world really do see nuclear weapons as a security threat instead of a security asset. And So I think it's really building up that global support and that global taboo against nuclear weapons to make it even less possible for Putin to consider using nuclear weapons. That is kind of the solution that, again, most countries that have joined the Treaty on the Prohibition of Nuclear Weapons have endorsed, and even we see broad support for this in kind of populations surrounding Russia. So it's there is a lot of engagement in kind of course in deterrence theory and in the belief that maybe if more countries had nuclear weapons, they could deter nuclear use by other countries. But ultimately, just given the unpredictability of nuclear weapons and nuclear risk, we really think that the most important thing is to bolster the norm against nuclear use, including by prohibiting nuclear weapons.
Thank you. We have another question from a faculty member who asks, has US President Biden made any policy statements about ICAN's goals?
So, yeah, I mean, we've engaged with the US administration, over the course of the negotiations and adoption of the treaty. And the US administration, subsequent successive US administrations have been consistently opposed to the work of ICAN and to the Treaty on the Prohibition of Nuclear Weapons, because it is currently the policy of the United States to continue to have possess nuclear weapons. And of course, the goal of the Treaty on the Prohibition of Nuclear Weapons is to stigmatize nuclear weapons towards their total elimination. And we've actually taken, I think, the often vehement opposition from the US and other nuclear armed states to this treaty as a sign that it is something that's actually having an impact. If it wasn't, they wouldn't dedicate any time to criticizing it, or in the case of US-UN Ambassador Nikki Haley during the negotiations, to actually holding a press conference outside of the negotiations to boycott and state why she was boycotting the negotiations. So we have seen there's been a downplay in the rhetoric of the administration against the treaty since the Biden administration took office. Under the Trump administration, there were actually memos sent out to countries calling on them to withdraw from the treaty, which is not something you typically hear from the US, calling on sovereign countries to withdraw their instruments of ratification from a treaty. And again, I think speaks to the power of the normative power of the treaty. We haven't heard any indication that the Biden administration has this policy and instead is seeking to I think acknowledge a bit more favorably the good faith efforts of the countries that have joined the treaty to work towards disarmament. But they still certainly don't support the treaty.
Thank you. We have a question about students. If a student wants to become more involved in work like ICAN's, what kind of training would you recommend?
Well, I think one thing that I think is really cool about ICAN is that it really it doesn't require you to have a PhD in nuclear politics to get involved. Really, we do think that the core, what you need to know about nuclear weapons is that they have devastating humanitarian consequences and need to be eliminated. And we have an international treaty to do that. And then from there, it's really kind of up to you what you want to do to get involved. We have local partner organizations across the US. For example, if you go to our website, icanw.org, you can go to your country profile page and see if there's a local partner organization near you that's working to promote the treaty in the United States in your community. And you can, just reach out to, if you have a local representative, see if they want to join our pledge to work to get the US to join the treaty. You can, if that goes well and you're feeling kind of empowered, you can reach out to your local city or town council and get them to pass a resolution. You can even just spread the word with other people. You can organize at your university. There are actually about 50 universities in the United States, and Franklin and Marshall is not one of them, gladly, that is involved in nuclear weapons production in the US. But maybe you have a friend at one of these universities, and you can find all this information on the ICAN website. We have a map that shows you where these universities are located. But they're really big ones, like the University of California system is very involved in nuclear weapons production. It's tied to the nuclear weapons laboratories that work to produce nuclear weapons. So there's really so much that you can do. And I think as a first step, you can check out our website, you can follow us on social media to see what's going on, and just join the people around the world that are engaged in the campaign.
Thank you. A staff member asks, how can this ban be realistically enforced? And how could it be manipulated by those who refuse to give up their nuclear weapons?
Yeah, absolutely. So it's a question we get a lot, and it's a big question for international law in general, is how do you enforce this treaty? There's no international police force. But what there are, as I was mentioning earlier, is there are international weapons inspectors, the International Atomic Energy Agency, which of course has been in the news lately because they went to Ukraine, to the Zaporizhzhia nuclear power plant to try to protect the safety of that power plant. But in addition to promoting kind of nuclear energy and the safety of nuclear energy, the IAEA also does work on ensuring that countries that have nuclear energy programs aren't diverting some of the nuclear material that can be used in energy programs for developing a weapons program. So these systems are already in place, and most countries around the world actually already have agreements with the International Atomic Energy Agency to have kind of regular inspections and to verify that they're not developing a nuclear weapons program. So it's something that already exists and already is in place and is also a part of this treaty. So I think that's kind of a key verification component. In terms of how to ensure that there's not a country that's sorry, what was the second part of that question? I'm not sure.
Yeah, how could the treaty be manipulated by those who refuse to give up their nuclear weapons?
Yeah. So I mean, I think the key component of the treaty, it is a voluntary treaty. Countries only join the treaty if they want to. And then when they join the treaty, they have these verification and inspections on their nuclear energy programs. So a key part of the treaty, and again, of kind of the universalization component, is encouraging all countries and pressuring all countries, building up the pressure on all countries to join the treaty and accept this verification. So, I think it's not likely that there is a scenario where a country joins the treaty and then continues to have a weapons program because of the inspections and verification that comes alongside with joining the treaty. And alongside that, I think the goal is that by the time a country joins the treaty, they will have made the choice that, like most countries in the world already believe, that nuclear weapons are not a security benefit for their country. And so they wouldn't want to pursue a nuclear weapons program.
Thank you. A student asks, as policy and research coordinator, what is your role within the organization?
Yeah, it's a great question. So, I mean, it's really I would say a dream job for me to get to work for ICAN, for a campaign, and to be really working on the policy and research side of things. I came to ICAN from working in think tanks, so I really had a research background. And my work, I'd say, kind of split into these two components, the policy side and the research side. So in terms of the policy side, what I do is often support our campaign organizations around the world by, providing information, background information on key nuclear policy developments. For example, when we're hearing threats from Russia, nuclear threats, I'll provide information to all of our campaigners about what's happening and how it relates to our work on the treaty, so that they can use that to get in touch with their local officials, with the media, to be a resource for them in terms of this work. And relatedly, when we go to international meetings at the UN, whether it's a meeting about our treaty or about another treaty or the UN General Assembly, I help to support our campaigners by providing, briefing notes and kind of key points that they can use or adapt as they choose in their context. Another component of it is the research side. So we produce research reports, and I kind of help to oversee or conduct those myself. For example, we do an annual report on nuclear weapons spending that looks at, provides an estimate of how much each country spend on nuclear weapons each year, and then looks at how much companies producing nuclear weapons receive, how much then companies pay lobbyists to work on nuclear weapons, and so on. So I also oversee our research programs.
Thank you. We have another question from a faculty member about the treaty. Did the US or any of the other 8 nuclear weapons states vote to adopt the treaty when it was overwhelmingly adopted, even if none of them have signed on to it yet? That would already indicate a powerful international public pressure that this treaty was capable of.
No, so the nuclear armed states all boycotted the negotiations of the treaty. And most NATO states also boycotted it due to their relationship under the nuclear umbrella. The one country that did participate was the Netherlands. And they did so actually due to public pressure from the population. The government had explicitly said they were not going to participate in the negotiations. And there was really a massive push from campaigners in the Netherlands calling on the government, campaigners as well as members of parliament, other members of the government, that really pushed on kind of the federal level to join the negotiations. And so they did so. And we saw this to a smaller extent at the first big meeting of the treaty, the first meeting of states parties, which took place in June, where there were a number of governments who, including the Netherlands again, who said they weren't going to participate in this meeting. And then there was a lot of push from campaigners in the countries to get them to join. So still no nuclear armed states participation, but we're working on it.
Thank you. You mentioned the humanitarian and environmental consequences of the Bikini Atoll thermonuclear test. Could you tell us a little bit more about the specific effects on that region?
Yeah, absolutely. And again, I really encourage you to check out some of our resources where you can hear directly from the survivors about the impacts. But in the Marshall Islands, there was really an enormous amount of nuclear testing by the United States there. And a lot of it was this atmospheric testing, which is even more devastating than the underground and underwater testing. And in terms of specific effects, I mean, a lot of people in the Marshall Islands continue to suffer from cancer, from genetic defects, from leukemia, from really a number of illnesses that are linked to radioactive exposure. In addition, I think in addition to these health and disease impacts, the Marshall Islands has also been incredibly environmentally contaminated. So there are still islands where people were evacuated decades ago, and they can't return to their traditional lands because they're too radioactive to return to. And I think this is, a huge environmental and also cultural burden on the people of the Marshall Islands to not be able to return to their homeland. And I've heard testimony as well from some people in the Marshall Islands that there are other diseases like diabetes, for example, that are related to nuclear testing because of the lack of access to their traditional foods and way of lifestyle. They've had to rely on these subsidies of kind of white sugar and white flour from the US government that's had, other, I guess, secondary or add-on health impacts. So it's really horrific, kind of the widespread humanitarian and environmental impacts on populations in the Marshall Islands, but really people around the world who were impacted by nuclear weapons testing.
Thank you. In the US, this is from a faculty member. In the US, people of color, especially the Black churches, Bayard Rustin, Coretta Scott King, Malcolm X, were among the first to oppose use of nuclear weapons, especially because the negative effects of use and testing has disproportionately fallen on people of color. Does ICAN or the UN treaty highlight the racist aspects of this history?
Yeah, I mean, this is something that I think is really remarkable about this treaty, is that for the first time as an international treaty, it references both the Hibakusha, the survivors of Hiroshima and Nagasaki, using this term, but also the disproportionate impact of nuclear weapons on women and girls, as well as on Indigenous peoples. And this is there's nothing like this in any other nuclear weapons treaty or fora in the UN. And this is something that I think we're really seeing continuing through the treaty and through the adoption of the Vienna Action Plan in June, which came after the first meeting of states parties, were states committed to really progressive actions, adopting, for example, a gender focal point to take forward the recognition of the disproportionate impacts and need for assistance of women and girls from nuclear weapons, as well as to facilitate the inclusion of Indigenous peoples within the treaty and treaty meetings. So I think it really is quite progressive, and it is a UN treaty, so there are always limitations, I think, within kind of these big international fora, but yeah, definitely as far as kind of other fora on nuclear weapons go, I think it's very progressive in recognizing these impacts.
Thank you. We have a couple minutes left, so I think this might be our last question, also from a faculty member. The nuclear winter debates of the 1980s first highlighted the horrendous climate effects of even a limited nuclear conflict. How much is that argument part of the rationale for the UN treaty?
I think it's really a key component, and part of this is some leading today, kind of the leading nuclear winter researchers who've taken forward the original work from all those years ago, including Alan Robach and Brian Toon, are really leaders of the treaty and the work on the treaty. And there was this letter that was signed by at least 100 scientists, including those two, but many other scientists as well, at the start of the negotiations to really encourage governments to adopt the treaty, given the widespread known consequences for the climate of any use of nuclear weapons. So I think it really is a key core component of the humanitarian consequences, is the impact on climate and the nuclear winter research that continues to this day.
Thank you so much, Alicia. Thank you for your talk today. Thank you, Emily, for interpreting for us today. It was wonderful to hear from you, and we hope to see you next week at our Common Hour at 11:30 a.m. Thank you.